We recently got a new lore drop from Christopher Awdry regarding the Railway series and the island of Sodor. Among other things, we found out that 2 standard gauge steam engines exist on the island that we'd never heard of before. A well tank engine called Aubrey and an unnamed Pannier tank engine. Not much information is known about these engines other than who owns them and their current occupation. So there's plenty of room for interpretation, and interpret these characters I will. All we know about Aubrey is that he's an 040 well tank engine that once worked on the North Western Railway and is currently owned by the Crovan's Gate Preservation Society. Everything else is up to interpretation. When it comes to engine classes to potentially base Aubrey on, I threw a few ideas around. There's the E. Burrows & Sons 040 well tank, although most people have gone with this design and I like to keep things fresh when it makes sense to do so. Another possibility is the Kitson 040T Cordite, but in the end I went with something similar to Ellesmere, built by Hawthorns & Company. This engine was built at the company's works in Leith, Edinburgh. One thing I'll mention is that I will be referencing a lot of the lore I've established in my earlier videos. I'll add cards when necessary, and recap most of the stuff that's relevant to this video, so don't worry too much about feeling lost. Aubrey originally worked for the North Western Railway before being preserved. So as not to interfere with my pre-existing lore, my headcanon is that Aubrey worked on the NWR prior to the introduction of its numbering scheme and didn't receive a running number. My line of thinking is that the NWR didn't have a proper numbering scheme until around 1935, when Henry the Green engine is set. This was the first book to include numbers on the engines aside from Thomas. Given that Thomas has always had a number 1, my thinking is that the North Western Railway always intended to have a numbering scheme, but took their time to actually implement it. I suppose when you don't have any 2 engines of the same class, and they all have names, numbering your fleet isn't top priority. It might even explain why 98462 and 87546 have running numbers that don't seem to line up with either the NWR or any mainland railway at the time. My theory is that, as the 2 engines were on loan originally, the Fat Controller gave them 5-digit numbers so as not to interfere with the numbering scheme that was being drafted up at the time. It's possible that Henry and Gordon also received similar numbers on arrival, but as they were given names and remained on Sodor, nobody bothered to remember them. But anyway, back to Aubrey. My idea is that he ran the Kirk-Ronan branch line during its early years. You may remember that another engine also ran the Kirk-Ronan branch, that being Lady. The branch line originally opened around 1915 or 1916, using the track bed of the old Sodor and Mainland Railway. The original Sodor and Mainland engines weren't available to run the line at that point. 2 of them were scrapped, and the other was owned by the Crovan's Gate Mining Company. As the NWR didn't have a lot of money, a lot of its engines during the early years were either loaned, inherited or purchased second hand. This explains why Lady and Aubrey were both fairly old engines even at the time, and were different locomotive classes from different builders. I decided to give them different colours as well, with Aubrey being black as opposed to Lady's dark magenta scheme. Having said that, I wanted to visually unify them, and so I've tried to give them similarities in their livery. Gold lining around the tanks and cab, names in cursive, and unpainted brass domes and chimney caps. Why didn't the Kirk-Ronan engines use a standard livery? I'll admit, when I first drew Lady in the Railway series style I hadn't really thought it through, But after giving it another think, it could be that the Fat Controller, or maybe some other high-ranking NWR official, saw the Kirk Ronan branch as something of a passion project and wanted to make it a little different from the regular NWR locomotives. I'd already theorised that Lady was named after Lady Hat after all. The other possibility is that Lady and Aubrey arrived on Sodor before the NWR had decided on the standard livery, and their liveries were something of an experiment. The Kirk Ronan branch line always struggled to make its money back, and by 1935 the branch had closed, with Sodor Roadways operating bus services connecting the towns previously served by the branch line. Aubrey, being the engine in the best condition, was sold off for industrial use, whereas Lady was kept at the sheds in Kirk Ronan. There were plans to preserve her, but nothing came of it at first, and she remained in the sheds for nearly 30 years thereafter. By the mid-1950s, the factory that Aubrey had been sold to had closed its doors, and Aubrey returned to Sodor. He was now being appointed as a shunter at Crovansgate Works, who operated semi-independently from the NWR. One day in 1962, Aubrey was surprised to see two engines coming into the works at once, both looking rather shaken up. Thomas was at the back, that much was obvious, but at the front was an engine he hadn't seen in a long time. Nevertheless, he recognised her instantly. The two engines were delighted to see each other. Aubrey recounted his adventures on the mainland, whereas Lady responded that she'd been left alone in the shed for decades. Aubrey was apologetic and wished that he'd done something about it at the time. He'd never have agreed to leave for the mainland if he knew that Lady was going to be left in a shed to rot away. But as far as Lady was concerned, it had already happened and wasn't worth panicking about anymore. It wasn't long before the Kirk Ronan branch line reopened, with Lady being the primary engine on the line. Aubrey was still the Crovansgate shunter at the time and had rarely left the works grounds, but once his old stomping grounds were reopened, he would often be let out for special occasions. As Sodor began to modernise, Aubrey started to work less often as a shunter. By the 1980s, most of his work was now being done by a British Railways Class 47. Part of Christopher Awdry's law drop involved confirming that the works diesel was not an NWR engine. This is why I decided to make Crovansgate semi-independent, so that the works diesel could remain a Sodor resident without being NWR owned. He could perform not only shunting duties, but also travel to and from the mainland to deliver equipment, not to mention Christmas trees. At the same time, Aubrey was not forgotten about. Whilst he was stored away privately, he would still make frequent visits to the Kirk Ronan branch line, and when the Crovansgate Preservation Society was established in 2025, he, along with Neil, officially became heritage locomotives. They can usually be found as part of a public display, but frequently run demonstration trains and even rail tours across the island of Sodor, not only on the Kirk Ronan branch line, but also the main line and other branch lines. As well as the two heritage locomotives, the Crovansgate Preservation Society is also in possession of many historic documents regarding the history of Sodor's railways, including information on the pre-grouping railways of Sodor before the formation of the NWR. Now I can segue into the topic of the official law-accurate names for the engines of the Wellsworth and Sudbury and the Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge railways, which Christopher Awdry revealed as part of the law drop. My initial reaction was, great, now I'm going to get people saying, actually you got their names wrong, in the comments of my videos on these engines for the remainder of time. And whilst I don't doubt that will happen, there's no point crying over spilt milk. The best thing I can do going forward is taking my headcanons for these engines and merging them with what we now know about them. To get everyone up to speed, Awdry gave the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway engines the names Reuben, Theodore, Julius and Willie. The Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge engines are Silas, Clarus, Clifford and Conrad. I will admit I was a little disappointed that all 8 names were masculine. I suppose Willie could be short for Wilma, but I'm not familiar with an actual instance of the name being used that way. But like I said, I can merge some of these ideas together. If you've watched my videos on these engines, you know I called W&S number 4 Betty, and Coffee Pots number 1 and 3 Minnie and Beryl respectively. Maybe they were built with the names Willie, Silas and Clifford before transitioning, or maybe vice versa. For the characters that I made male or non-binary, like Wesley, Roger and Danny, I can just refer to as Julius, Clarus and Conrad from here on out. Then there's Billy and Charlie. My idea was to fit 2 characters from the TV series into the Railway series, a plan which has been somewhat scuppered. But again, the best thing I can do is merge the 2 ideas together. The names for W&S numbers 1 and 2 are now Reuben and Theodore. There are 2 possible workarounds I've thought of. The first is that Reuben and Theodore were named after directors or other important figureheads, called William Reuben and Charles Theodore. Although named after their surnames, the engines were gradually referred to more and more by the directors' first names, and then diminutive forms thereof. The other possibility is that Billy and Charlie were built as replicas of Reuben and Theodore, but didn't feel comfortable posing as scrapped engines they'd never met, and so changed their identities. But with all that said, here is the completed picture. Here is the other character that Christopher Awdry revealed the existence of. Following Duck's relocation to the Arlesborough branch line, the Fat Controller acquired another Pannier tank engine to arrange trains at Tidmouth Station. An idea I want to go with for the Pannier tank is a somewhat nerdy, bookish type, or as close to a bookish type as an engine can be. Maybe somewhat like a librarian or secretary, complete with nerd glasses. She had once worked on a branch line, where her work included a mixture of shunting and pulling trains, but she always preferred shunting and arranging things into a specific order. The other engines think she's a nutcase for this, but she takes it in her stride. Once she was withdrawn from service on British Railways, she was sold to an industrial railway which only served to further fuel her interest in shunting. Rika, as I decided to call her, sets herself apart from other shunting engines by seeing shunting as an art form. Most shunting engines, even the ones who are very good at it, see shunting mainly as a means to an end. They're not especially bothered about the shunting itself, though of course many would rather be shunting than doing nothing at all. They mainly want to get the job done so they can move on to something else, like pulling a train or moving to the next train to shunt. Rika not only enjoys shunting, but is always actively looking for ways to improve her craft. As far as she is concerned, there's no such thing as perfection. I wanted to base her off of a Hawksworth Pannier, but at first I wasn't sure whether to base her on a 9400 or the smaller 1600 Pannier. In the end I went with the 9400 due to having a distinctive silhouette compared to Duck. But I was considering the 1600 mainly because, in my timeline, she would not be doing the work alone. You may remember from an earlier video of mine that Tidmouth already has a station pilot following Duck's departure, that being Dennis. It might be that Rika's reason for arriving was because Dennis was being increasingly entrusted with short mainline goods work. But it's also possible that the work in the yard became too much for Dennis on his own, even after he was rebuilt to have his kinks ironed out. The reason I want to base Rika on a Hawksworth design is so that she could have been built by British Railways, thus having no emotional connection to the Great Western Railway. She was painted black when she first arrived on Sodor, but then saw James. She really took to James's striking red paint. "I want to be painted like that," she said to the workmen at Croven's Gate. They obliged, but when Rika entered service resplendent in her new red livery, the railwaymen were worried that James would be jealous. But James wasn't jealous at all. In fact, he was flattered that a new engine would decide to get painted in a livery like his. He complimented Rika on her taste in colour, and decided to take Rika under his proverbial wing, teaching her all there was to know about shunting. This was rich coming from James, of course. He hadn't shunted his own trains for about 50 years by this point, and he wasn't particularly good at it back then. Rika cautiously went along at first, not being sure what to make of it all. Then there's Duck. He was happy to see another Pannier tank on Sodor. "Ah, I see you're as Great Western as I am." But when Rika responded with, "Great what's it?" Duck was dismayed. He was rather hoping that the younger Pannier tanks would continue to honour the legacy of the Great Western Railway, nationalisation or no nationalisation. Duck tried to teach Rika the Great Western way of shunting trains, but Rika's methods are, if anything, more efficient. "Forget it, Duck," said James. "Rika takes after me." "I do not," replied Rika indignantly, putting her wheel down. "I'm my own engine. I'm not Duck Jr. and I'm certainly not James Jr. But, stuttered James. "But the red paint." "I just chose this red so it would be easier for my driver and fireman to spot me," replied Rika, and she continued merrily shunting trains as if nothing had happened. It's unconfirmed, but likely that Christopher Awdry envisioned the new Pannier tank to be number 12, since Barry is number 13. I also gave Barry the number 13, but I've already allocated the number 12 to Rosie. Given that Walter is number 14, Rika would probably be number 15. This presents a bit of a problem because it seems unlikely that Rika would have arrived on Sodor after Barry, let alone Walter. The most likely possibility is that the NWR had an earlier number 13 and 14, whom had left Sodor before the arrival of Barry and Walter. So, Rika was the 15th steam engine on Sodor at the time of her arrival. As Dennis was already working as a station pilot at Tidmouth by the time Duck left to run his branch in 1967, Rika doesn't have to have arrived on Sodor by then, hence why I decided that she'd worked on an industrial railway before coming to Sodor. My line of thinking is that she arrived on Sodor sometime during the 1970s. And, with that said, here is the finished picture. And there we are, the two new steam engines that we know thanks to the Christopher Awdry lore drop. It's been interesting to work with what are essentially brand new characters, as well as discussing other elements of the lore drop and how I can mould my universe around them. I hope this video has entertained you, and if it has, be sure to like, comment and subscribe if you haven't already done so.